Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's open air conversation. My name is Dexter Wimberly. I'm a curator who works with galleries and museums all over the place. Some of you may know that. Otherwise, I'm just happy to be here with today's artist. We have a fantastic conversation for you today. I'm going to go ahead by introducing her. Helina Metaferia is an interdisciplinary artist working across collage, assemblage, video, performance, and social engagement. Her work integrates archives, somatic studies, and dialogical practices, creating overlooked narratives that amplify BIPOC femme bodies. Metaferia received her MFA from Tufts University School of the Museum of Fine Arts and attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Her recent solo exhibitions include Museum of Fine Arts Boston in 2022, New York University's The Gallatin Galleries in 2021, the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco in 2017. Metaferia her work is in the Sharjah Biennial in the United Arab Emirates, the Tennessee Triennial, through the Frisch Art Museum and Fisk University Art Gallery. Her work is in the permanent collection of institutions, including the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, RISD Art Museum, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City. Metaferia's work has been written about in publications including the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Art News, and Hyperallergic. Metaferia is also an assistant professor at Brown University in the Visual Art Department and lives and works in New York City. I want to welcome Helina to today's conversation. How are you?
Hello, Dexter. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really great to see you. I'm in New York City for a change. Normally, I do these from a place far away from here, 6,000 miles away in Japan. But I'm happy to be in Brooklyn doing this conversation with you. And where are you today?
I'm in Harlem. I'm in my home. So we're both in New York City, but we're doing it all virtually for everyone watching.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, there's a lot I want to get into today, and I kind of like sped through your bio. Sorry if I was going too fast, but I really wanted to kind of like get into our conversation. So, I imagine that a lot of people joining us today are here either A, they know about you and they're just interested to hear what you have to say, or B, they don't know much about you at all and they're interested to hear what you have to say. So I'd love to just give you a moment. It doesn't have to be long, but tell me a little bit more about you, other than what I just read in your biography. Like, why? I'll ask you something kind of like, you probably don't even like this question, but what made you become an artist? Like, what brings you to this space as a creative person? Like, what is that? What is that driving force?
That's a really great question. What made me become an artist? I didn't even know I could be an artist. This could actually be a viable path until I had some Black women educators who just saw my, I guess, creativity at a young age and really propelled me into, like, encouraged me along. And I think I'm an educator because of that reason, because I've always had some sort of mentorship or leadership in the form of Black women who pulled me aside and said, this is something that you could actually do. And why art? I come from a very bold family that encouraged me to think about ideas that are abstract and very concrete, such as liberation and freedom and what that looks like. And as an artist, I can imagine and co-create the kind of world that I'd like to see when I'm dissatisfied with the world that we live in. My parents were not activists. We're not artists. I do not have any artists in my family that I know of. But they were very expansive thinkers as educators and as activists and people who were just concerned about the world. And so I was always encouraged to think critically. And that combined with some angel art teachers in public high schools, that is why I'm here.
No, I totally get that. I get that. Yeah, education seems to be such a big part of your life. I mean, as I mentioned in the introduction in your bio, you're also an assistant professor, and so you're a practicing artist, but also still very connected to academia as well. It seems like that's probably been like a recurring theme in your life. Let's talk a little bit about the work that you make. It seems like collaboration is a big part of your practice, and I'd love to hear like more about that, and why is collaboration important to you?
Well, I'm interested in dispelling the myth that the art world sort of perpetuates that there is a sole genius behind a work. I oftentimes, in my museum labels or in my artist statements or art books, I will highlight all the people that it takes to make a project, including all the assistants and the curators and fabricators and all of these sort of things. Everyone from the person that frames my work to printing, production, everything. And I think that my interest in transparency is also because I come from an education background. But I don't think that the world, anything that's impressive or amazing or great could come from isolation. Like, yes, there's a place and time for that, but really it's about community building for me. And part of community building is naming and crediting. So I am really interested in this idea of demystifying an art practice, and there's collaboration in that way. And also just to achieve something beyond oneself, one often has to work in cooperation with others. And I think it's my little gesture and nod towards dispelling some of the myths that patriarchy and I think extractive capitalism can bring about, this competitiveness that is oftentimes something that is perpetuated in systems, including the art world. But I think the opposite for me is community building and thriving in spaces where learning and growing happens. And that usually often for me comes through interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, I really like
And I
that
will add,
idea.
I'll add one more thing about collaboration as a medium. Like, I work in social engagement just as much as I work in collage or in video, and social engagement is a skill set as technical as painting or drawing is.
Can you talk a little bit more about social engagement for those who are not really familiar with that terminology, and also what that entails?
Yeah, social engagement can be called many different things. It can be called social practice. It can be called community-based art. It could be called new genres, or there's so many different names. But people who really work with people as collaborators, co-conspirators, or medium. And I think that because my work is branching off into different mediums, whether that's performance or video or collage, there's always a social element. And for me, that's part of my interest in storytelling. I can tell as many stories as I want about my own perspective, but what I really want to do is open up my platform and share my platform and have others come in and tell their stories too.
Yeah, I really like what you said about highlighting the work that is often hidden or invisible. You know, there's that term invisible labor, right? And there's a lot of invisible labor in the art world. And I think that the idea of making space to acknowledge all of the people who are part of the process, not only of making a work, but also bringing an exhibition into existence. I think that's admirable, and it's something that I think about often, and have been encouraging people that I work with to sort of consider that as well. All the hands that go into making a show or an artwork. In your artist statement, you said that your work interrogates complex histories of institutionalized and systemic oppression. And I want to talk about what that means to you. What are those complex histories, and just share your thinking around that.
Yeah, as an artist, I know my limitation. I do not have any answers to any of the world's problems, by the way. I'm just thinking out loud, and I'm very fortunate to have a process that allows me to do that. So that when I feel frustrations, or when I see something in the news, or I hear something that's happened to a dear friend, or experience something, I have an outlet. And that is really powerful for me. And one of those things that I've come across in my practice is thinking about all these individual occurrences, whether that's police brutality, or whether that's issues around the global warming, and I think about them as sort of interrelated and coming from, and this is where history becomes important to my practice and research becomes important to my practice, a really old system designed around fear. And I
Mm.
did some deepening, particularly in my readings and my research. And I did some studying with this amazing woman named Milagros Phillips, who talks about 500 years of racial oppression in this country in particular. And I did some of that research, and I started to think and say, well, a lot of these things are very interrelated, and they are based on histories that predate us. But the earth is very old, so maybe 500 years of oppression has some roots in 1,000 years of oppression, or 2,000 years of oppression. And so I start to think about what the through lines are and how that influences our personal day-to-day lives and our interpersonal connections. And whether that's roots in colonization and genocide that this country has been, founded upon, transatlantic slave trade, all of these things inform our day to day. And so sometimes when I think about a particular occurrence, like a micro within this whole macro that we live in, these long histories, I can find the roots, and I can see the through lines, and I can trace back how some of those things might be informed, and probably maybe even out of our immediate control we may feel, by something that predates us. So I'm really interested in this idea of like an ancestral intelligence, or an ancestral knowing, or kind of tapping into histories that have come before us as almost like a whispering for survival into our present day, but using that information to think about a constructive future, and collaboratively coming up and imagining what a future may look like, if we can sort of heal somatically, or through sort of facing this very old war, essentially civil war, that's occurring at least nationally. If we can kind of think about new systems to reimagine what our world could be like. And for that, I also mean from a very global perspective, but also a national or regional perspective.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think that and thank you for that. I think that the idea that one should sort of think about time, and also think about systems and how those things are sort of interconnected with one another. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but it's also something I think about often. I mean, the world we live in is constructed off of rules that, in many cases, have been foisted upon us. But those rules are not all natural, right? And they can be shifted and they can be changed. And what the world looks like to us today can be radically different if certain things are put in place. But I want to also talk about where ritual fits into your artistic practice. And there was some reference to ritual in your statement, your artist statement, and other things that I've seen written about you. Um, Perhaps you could share something about that.
Yeah, I was born in Washington, D.C. to two Ethiopian parents, or two Ethiopian people. So I am first generation American, and I was educated in the West, and got my undergrad at a historically Black college called Morgan State, and my graduate degree from Tufts University. But I really had to teach myself some of my Ethiopian cultural traditions, particularly around the intersection of visual art and ritual. And so learning African art history independently as a professional artist has got me much more comfortable with referencing practices, and also adapting languages, whether it's visual language or verbal language, about another way of knowing and thinking and being and creating, where the theatrical, the performative, the ritualistic intersects with objects. And that's kind of an extension of my practice. So my practice in a kind of a Western canon would be quantified or qualified as like performance art, or social engagement, or activism as art. But that really starts to look a lot like Ethiopian Coptic talisman traditional practices that I adopt and bring into my collage work, and that I bring into my performance work. And so I'm actually this very diasporic person on this hybrid journey of bringing together my two cultures that raised me, being born and raised in the US and educated here, but then having this sort of awareness of African practices based on being a part of an Ethiopian community. My first experience with Ethiopian art was outside of Coptic church and things that I grew up in, was a internship that I had at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore when I was maybe an undergraduate student. And this internship had a really strong effect on me. It was in the Ethiopian curatorial department, and I was the first Ethiopian person working in the Ethiopian curatorial department as an intern at 20 years old. And I was asked to like help transcribe some manuscripts that were written in Amharic and Giz with my very fundamental reading abilities, very, very little that I have of that culture. And I was just thinking, well, gosh, a lot of these artworks to me felt very much out of context from what I knew them to be, having grown up in these spiritual traditions. And I knew, first of all, I was not a curator. Like, I was like, oh no, this is not for me at all. But I also knew that I wanted to be an artist, and I wanted to make work that was maybe in that museum context, but really was for that museum context, not work that was brought out of context. And so very interestingly, this fall, there's going to be a big traveling exhibition of Ethiopian contemporary art at the Walters Museum, where I had my internship 20 years ago, and I will be a part of that exhibition. So I'm like kind of planted the seed, like, I don't know, 20 years ago, like, hey, I want to be in this museum, but not as a curator and not with this kind of artwork. And now 20 years later, I kind of jumped that up. So I kind of feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
That's amazing. That's amazing. That's like, the quintessential full circle.
Yeah.
Working across all of these disciplines, is that something that you've always done, or did you sort of over time start adding other things to your repertoire? Like, can you talk about how that came to be?
Yeah, so I was exposed to art in public schools in Maryland, and you learn the basics of painting and drawing and things like that. And that's kind of what I kept up doing. And I got an undergraduate degree in painting, and I painted and kept a studio after that. And I actually felt very bored. I was so bored, like with my figure painting. And I knew I loved art, but I just was like, this isn't it for me. And maybe 8 years of figure painting, and I was like ready to go to grad school. And I was invited by an amazing artist named Maria Magdalena Campos Pons to study with her, and she was in Boston. And I was like, where is Boston? Like, okay, I've never been there. I think I'll take a whim and follow this woman who seems to know what she's talking about, and very also much interested in ritual and from a diasporic perspective as an Afro-Cuban. And when I was at the museum school at Tufts, oh my God, I just fell down this rabbit hole of taking every single, I came in as a painter and I walked out, which is very typical of that school, doing everything but, and I was just a hybrid of performance and video and installation, and then quickly went into academia at San Francisco Art Institute teaching new genres. And then I was like, okay, this is actually what I want to do. But I still missed the object. I missed the object because something for the object still speaks to me. And I think that goes back to my interest in like the talisman traditions in Ethiopia. So I had all this performance documentation after years of doing residencies and just living all over the country and making art that's really hard to commodify. And so then I just saw, like, I have all these photographs of myself in these weird positions from these performances because I always heavily documented my work. So I started cutting them up and collaging them with archives that I would find on this residency journey. And the first set of archives I would collage with is like old art news and art forums that I found at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art. Like the whole decade, every decade was there for Art in Americas. And I just grabbed all the materials that were free. And I was like, oh, let me look at the 1980s because that's when I was born. I saw no Black women. I saw no people of color. And I just started collaging my performance stills with like paintings by old white men. And I had this very feminist critical view in my work. And when I looked into the art histories, I was starting to see like Hannah Hawk's work, her collage work, Hardina Pendel's work, everything was institutional critique. And I was like, okay, I've been critiquing institutions since I was 20 as a curatorial intern. I just didn't have all the visual vocabulary. But like a true feminist, like I was raised to be by my mom, I started to align myself with like the work of like the Guerrilla Girls, the work of like Adrian Piper, like all of these people that were just passing the baton to me as I will one day pass the baton to somebody else, interrogating the systems that we live in. And I found collage and performance and video to be the radical sort of mediums that gave me the voice and the space that I needed that painting couldn't do for me. Like painting just wasn't that for me. I might paint one day. Let's not take that off the table because I still remember
Right.
how to do it. But I just find joy, and I didn't care about what the market wanted because the market wants painting. I didn't care about showing I had technical skill because that bored me. I wanted to show, like, I wanted art that moved people and moved my body and moved and organized. And that to me was like these other mediums. And now I'm just having fun every day. So that's what I want to do.
Yeah, I could see that, and I think it's a really interesting approach to having a career when one thinks about building a practice that's not relying solely on the gallery system and thinking about how
Mm-hmm.
to engage with the public. And in many ways it's sort of ironic because I've seen quite a few artists who are interdisciplinary, who are working across all sorts of ideas and concepts, and that work can only actually be engaged with in an institutional setting or out in the public, right? There's really no gallery infrastructure, because you used the word commodify, right? Like there's no real gallery infrastructure for that kind of work because it frankly can't really be sold, right? And it can hardly be collected. It sort of has to happen when it's happening. But what's great about that path is that it, if done correctly, it can automatically put you into dialogue with museums. It can automatically put you into dialogue with larger nonprofits and institutional opportunities that many artists think you have to go through the gallery system in order to get access to those opportunities and platforms, and you really don't. So that's my thoughts on that. We have some images of your work, and I'd like to get those on the screen so we can talk more specifically about how you go about making work. You mentioned collage in your process of looking at archives. Maybe you can share a little bit about this piece that's on the screen now, and also tell us a bit about how you make it.
Yeah, so this is Headdress 30, which was shown at Museum of Fine Art Boston. And it's where do I begin with my collage work? There's so many different ways of collaging for me. The one I talked about before was a series called Refiguring the Canon, where I use my own performance stills. But now I'm using the performance stills and the images of others in my community or communities that I help to facilitate and create through workshops. So this is part of a Byway Revolution series, and Byway Revolution is super open, interdisciplinary, can be any medium. The through line is celebrating femmes, BIPOC femmes, so cis and trans, who are either being activated or activists in the world. And what I mean by that is I do workshops, social engagement workshops that are only open to BIPOC femmes around the country, and partnering with institutions or organizations to find the audience who wants to do that work. And then we do a protest as performance workshop that's 3 hours long. There is no documentation allowed. It is specifically for these women, as a way to also just tap into our bodies, to release institutionalized trauma, to basically figure out how to move together. And it's a deepening experience of deep intimacy. And afterwards, we think about the image and the constructed image. And I'm thinking about the archives of like the Black Panthers, who were very keen on their image and who radicalized their image and made it almost fashionable to become an activist in order to move their cause forward. And they were countering the media in a lot of ways. I think of Black Lives Matter as a hashtag that came from a performance movement into a global movement. And they're also very keen on how they use social media to advance their cause. So I'm thinking about ways in which the media can be constructed. So then I'll photograph them, and then I will do an interviewing process. And I'll interview them for, sometimes it's a few weeks to a year, until I get into an ancestry and think about, all of the things that allow them to take up space today. And then I'll do research. I have a research assistant, so it's like not just me, because it's a lot of archives to get through. And I'll partner with a local library that's local to where I did the workshop. So this was a workshop that I did. This is Jahari Ortega, who's the model. She was a mass art student. So I did a workshop with Tufts University and mass art and Northeastern and Emerson in advance of my Museum of Fine Arts solo show. And then I photographed them, and then the archives came from Northeastern University and Harvard University of local Boston radicalism archives since the 60s to the 80s. Everything from intersectional feminism to civil rights movements and marches, etc. And so, and queerness and queer liberation movements. And so after the interview process, I would pair the person with the archives. And usually, and always actually, so far, knock on wood, everyone's loved their collage. They don't get to see it until it's in a show. So it's, it's always going to be an unveiling. But to me, this is process-based work. It's not just an object. And to go back to your point about the object and the institution and then the I don't know. I love it all. I realize I love objects. I love making things. This is to scale. This is 8 foot by 4 foot. That person is printed to their actual size. And I just created a body in the room, a brown, black body in the room. And I'm always thinking about institutional critique, right? I went to the School of Museum of Fine Arts, and so in grad school, I would go to that museum, and I didn't see a lot of black and brown bodies celebrated at that time. It's changed since now. The collecting practices have changed for sure. But for me, it's exciting to see black and brown women take up space, life size, on the walls of this museum. And so that was my paying it forward and arming the next generation.
That's exciting. That's exciting. Let's advance to the next image, and I have a follow-up question. So much of what you're doing in these works is taking place on the person's head. And why is that? And can you talk a little bit about it?
Well, I'm sitting at a hybrid of cultures. So I have an Ethiopian American ancestry. And so I'm thinking a lot about the ways in which Ethiopia was able to sort of deal with colonial oppression. And through the monarchy and through a lot of organizing, they were able to defeat the Italians not just once but twice. And so this is a slow like a little nod towards resistance culture, thinking about crowning and adornment, thinking about regality, thinking about how we show up as Black women adorning our hair in the face of white supremacy and patriarchy. We taking care of ourselves, celebrating each other, giving these women flowers while they're alive. I'm also thinking about the cerebral. I'm thinking about, everything that informs us, how we, the knowledge and the awareness that we possess about our histories can also arm us once we process it and let it move through our bodies. It arms us to take up space and confidence in predominantly white spaces, but also all types of spaces where we're expected to bow our heads, we raise them. So I have a lot of Black is Beautiful 70s stuff going on in there, and I'm owning it. That's kind of the work. The headdresses are also very regal looking, and it's about adornment. I'm looking at headdresses from different cultures of the people, the central figure, but they also are very heavy. Like they're very much weighing them down. So there's this conflict of like this impossible headdress to carry that's beautiful, but could one actually carry all that weight of all that history on one's head or one's shoulders or one's body? It's almost impossible. And so the impossibility of how Black and brown women, how we grace the everyday world when things are against us. Yeah.
No, that's a great explanation. Thank you. Let's advance to the next image, which I think would be a bit different. So yeah, I'll just leave it to you to share what you can about what we're seeing here.
So this one is named after, I've made some physical crowns out of brass. It's really hard to see in the image, but there's actually etchings of archives. So the same archives that I'm collaging is the same ones that are engraved in the crown. And it's modeled after Queen Sheba's crown, who was an Ethiopian queen. So I'm looking at drawings, I'm looking at paintings of this, historic figure. And each crown that I make, and it's like a very small edition of them, they are modeled after a different Ethiopian queen. So again, a nod to my own personal culture. And then these are worn, I wear them during performances. So you'll see in a later slide where that becomes activated. And so I'm interested in, again, the intersection of objects and ritual. And so the performance is highly ritualistic. The crown is the artifact. I was recently in Ethiopia a few months ago, and so I got to see some of these crowns in person, and I was just doing this like on a family trip, but doing incredible research and thinking about just sort of the remnants of a time where there was a lot of political organizing, and also there was a lot at stake, and I'm not romanticizing that particular monarchy, but I am saying that there was something that was inspiring to the diaspora, the African diaspora from that period. It inspired other movements. Very similarly, when I look at the Black power movement or the civil rights movement, I think about the intersection of that with like the Young Lords and like other sort of protest movements that were happening at that time. So one starts to influence and enforce and influence and encourage the other. My father's a political scientist, and he often taught me, a lot growing up. I would hear these stories about how Harlemites, and I live in Harlem, they would sign up during like the 1920s and 1930s, or actually the 1930s, to fight in Ethiopia against the Italians, because they were so moved by that period of time and sort of like this anti-colonial history. And so this idea of this diasporic influence is what really excites me as an Ethiopian diasporic person, as an Ethiopian American.
Wow, wow. And can you talk a bit about, like, is this work we're seeing here sort of an outlier, or is this sort of in line with other works that you're doing? Are you doing quite a bit of this kind of sculptural work with making physical crowns, or was this sort of like a one-off?
So far there are three. I'm making like a couple more. I want to keep them like not as prevalent as the image. First of all, I take longer to fabricate, but also it's just they're really designed for my head. Like nobody else. They're not for every crown. So it's like if I need a performance, if I want to have a crown for the performance, if I want a new one, I'll have to to fabricate one. And I'm not trying to make them for everyone. I've never made a headdress of me with my image, but I love the idea of having these crowns. So I make them, and then usually, and you'll see in another image, those crowns get passed. So they'll be on my head for just a short period of time, and they get passed to audience members. They get passed to collaborators that perform with me, singers. I did a performance with my 11-year-old niece. She wore the crown as we talked about stories of activist women in our families over 5 generations. So the crown is always passed, which is part of my pedagogy as a professor. It's part of my work in social engagement and collaboration. Like I'm always thinking about the we, not just the I. And sometimes in performance work, the I is emphasized. And sometimes in social engagement work, it's all about the we, it's about the community. But I'm interested in that intersection of like the personal is political, the personal does influence the we, it can galvanize the we. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in here.
Fantastic. Let's advance to the next image. Quite different. So, what are we seeing here?
So in all of my work, there's always archive, there's a reference to the body, and there's a reference to a conversation or a story. So the archives, this is a wearable tapestry that's in the Sharjah Biennial currently. It's nicknamed Tarik Tanagari, which in Amharic means storyteller. And so each one of I've only done, again, very limited of these. They're silkscreen on fabric, and you can see in a detail shot, which is the next slide, you could see kind of like what the makeup is. It's like these, and I will say that for every one of the collages, as well as the tapestry and the crown, there's a bibliography for all the archives that I'm doing. So there is a sort of like academic scholarship, but I do want to publicly name the public institutions where these archives live. So I believe these archives came out of Michigan State University's Radicalism collection, and they're of civil rights movement, newspapers and books. And so there's this idea of protest, and then this it becomes abstraction when you look at it from a distance. There is paint in there. There is like material exploration, because at the end of the day, it's not just about the intellectual stuff. It's about the making. And then these tapestries get worn in the performance that I do, where I pass the tapestries on to others. They become robes. And so the tapestry, the shape of it reminds me of the Ethiopian talisman traditions that I'm often referencing in my work, this sort of like African art history. And then the wearableness of it references the body, the archive in the body. So the archiving process that I use is either like library archived images. I'm also referencing oftentimes somatic, like DNA storytelling, things that are in our bones, right? Like these stories that live within our DNA, they live within our memories and our psyche. I'm also referencing like oral histories in my work. Oftentimes there's oral histories in the video art or in the performance work. And then there's like created archives. Like, can I find material, everyday material, and make an archive of that and collect and rearrange and use assemblage? So that's kind of like what this one is.
Well, you mentioned there's a detail, so why don't we advance to that so everyone can kind of see what you're referring to, right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
when you're reproducing these archives, are you like what is that process? Are you photographing them, then having them printed on fabric? What can you get into the technical aspect of that?
Yeah, so all of the archives are hand scanned, or scanned by either like by a librarian, myself, or a research assistant. They are painstakingly like organized in various folders digitally, and then they're printed. In this case, this is printed and silk screened onto fabric, and then the fabric is hand stitched. So there's like a lot of tactility in the work too, because it's not just this thing that lives in a book. Now it lives on a fabric, and this fabric is made into almost like a quilting tradition. So I'm looking at African American histories of quilting as another way of storytelling. And then the fabric and the quilting and then the tapestry becomes on the body. And so there's this bit of adornment that goes back and becomes a through line in my work, right? This idea of regality and this idea of sort of the wearable as this way in which transformation can happen, whether it's like transforming our bodies into this image of beauty or image of power through the external. So yeah, that's kind of what's happening here. But there's also like, paint, there's, I don't know,
Hmm.
charcoal. I mean, I am getting back into the bag of like painting and drawing. I think
Right,
that's probably
right.
my itch, is to get back into that, because I'm like, okay, I've done all the other paper stuff. Now I'm like fabric. Fabric is so close to canvas. So I'm like, you might see these on canvas next. I don't know, but I have been
Yeah. It's
resisting
like
getting back into
it's, it's,
painting.
it's kind of bringing you back to that.
Yeah,
I see I see the
it's
road
all
you're
coming
on, and
together.
yeah, I see the road you're on. I kind of
Yeah,
see where it's heading. So let's
yeah, yeah,
advance to
yeah.
the next one.
So
Sure.
this work is at the Sharjah Biennial as well. The last few slides were in Sharjah. And I will tell you, I didn't know what I was going to do when I did this. I brought everything for the Sharjah Biennial, which is one of the biggest shows I've done, in my suitcase from New York to United Arab Emirates, and including these photographs. I have about 15 photographs of Black women activist artists. And then I asked for local black sand, and they gave me a little bit of black sand. And God bless Carmen Hassan and all the curatorial team, because they went back like 10 times to every location they could find to find locally sourced blacks. I mean, I really put them through it, but thank God they did, because I really love the way it came out, if I may say so. I knew I wanted to sculpt these photographs. I wanted to collage with sand. Like, I wanted to bury, I wanted to hide, I wanted to reveal. I didn't know how much sand it would take to do that, but it took a lot. So there's about 15 photographs that are buried in these nooks and crannies in the walls and on the floors and then by the doors of throughout the installation. So I have 3 rooms in the Sharjah Biennial that are currently up. One thing I didn't expect about the sand is it settles over time. Like, I hadn't thought that through, but it's okay. It's the first time I did it. So the installation looks different every day because the sand does something different on its own. But for me, I've been using black sand for about it's like maybe 2017 as this, maybe no, 2015. I've been using different kinds of sand, black sand included, different colors. But I love the idea of like black girl magic in my work. So for me, the sand could be charcoal painting, it could be graphite, it could be like an artistic medium. It could also be, I don't know, something that's like much more like a medicinal sort of aspect to it. It could just be the earth.
Mhm, mhm,
And so I'm like burying
mm.
women who have died, reburying like their memory, their photograph, but they kind of come back up. So they're like not completely gone. And I think about the memory of the photograph that it holds. I think about the story in the photo, but I also think of the calling of ancestors, the resurrecting of that. And quite honestly, I arm myself every day with either my familial, my political, or my artistic, ancestors. I will say that I started by way of revolution when my mother passed in 2016. She was an Ethiopian women's rights activist. And so the burying for me was also like I was grieving my mom when I first started this project many years
Mm.
ago. It's been 7 years and I'm in a much healthier place, but thanks to art. And so for me, it was like I'm always thinking about legacy because I wanted to honor her legacy as a woman activist, and all the work and service she had done. And I was thinking, where would we be if we don't archive the women who do all the emotional labor, who do
Right.
all the intellectual labor, the admin of organizing work, like all that stuff that doesn't get on the museum label, that doesn't get in the books, that doesn't get in the, um, yeah, I mean, I love like Hank's current project with Coretta Scott King, where he's like, naming Coretta next to Martin Luther King. I'm like, okay, this is what it takes. It takes these small gestures of artists and thinkers and historians to also name the women who did the labor in all types of movements. So anyway, that's this project.
Well, I'm imagining you traveling to the United Arab Emirates with all of this stuff. It's interesting thought. um, we have some questions that have come in, but I want to make our way through the slide presentation, and then I will get to the questions that have come in. So let's advance to the next slide. So this is
This
more
is
of what
another
you were
detail.
describing. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Another
mean, the
one
thing about this,
typing it too.
I imagine the sand is also sensitive to vibration, uh, and other things. Is it in the vitrine? Can you describe like how it's, is it exposed to the elements?
So the building is called Betat Sakal. It's a historic building. And there's these natural like nooks and crannies in the wall. I mean, when the curator who invited me to do this project, Hor Al Kasami, when she invited me, she was like, I think you would do well in this space. And the architecture was so inviting to me. I knew I had to not leave that empty. I had to activate it, which is why I brought photographs. And I was like, sand, something will happen. And then bowls. I was like, okay, we're going to do some bowls because I knew for the performance, which when we see the slides for the performance, you'll see the through line of the last few works that I've shown you. They all come together in the performance. These are all elements in the performance. And one thing that I have decided for myself and learned about exhibiting work that's driven by performance is you reveal all the objects that you use. Because
Mm.
even though they are not being activated in the moment, they are signifying that they will be activated at some point, at any point. A ritual can happen. And so these are works that actually, that particular bowl, that particular photograph, they were all used in the performance.
I see. I see. So let's advance to the next slide because I think that's going to take us to seeing the performance. Great. Wonderful. So
So
tell
the
us about the
performance,
concept.
it took place outside of Betal Sakal, which is across from the Sharjah Art Museum. This is the second time I performed this performance. I may do a third. Every one is different. Every iteration is different, but there is a through line. So it always has photographs of women, Black women activists who are deceased. It will include some people outside of myself, including the audience members. And then it will include the tapestry, the crown, the black sand, or not. It doesn't always have black sand, but it will have some elements that are in the installation that's there. And if you could advance to the next slide, you can see a detail
Sure.
view. And so here, I invited two singers from New York City, Abby Dobson and Erin Maya, who are part of the Resistance Revival Chorus, which is a women uh, activist musical group, and which I protested a lot with in 2020 alongside the Wide Awakes. And they had graced the presence with sound, which is not my skill set with song, but somehow I hummed along with them and I did my little singing part. And then Abby Dobson had this beautiful song called "Her Memory Is My Memory," and if you go to my website, you can see a snippet of the performance, like a 2-minute snippet. But "Her Memory Is Her Memory" is something she had written, and it was so perfect with the whole gesture. And so we activated the memories of 3 Black women activists, Nina Simone, Bell Hooks, and Toni Morrison, who inspired us. So we're thinking about an artistic lineage. It starts with these 3 Black women, and then we pass the crown to each other. So all 3 of us wear the regalia, and then we bring in the audience. So we choose 3 Emirati women to come in and to be adorned, and then they in return pass it on, and then they give roses to women in the audience. So it is like this ongoing legacy that keeps happening, that keeps sharing and gets transformed through our bodies and then on and passed on to the next. The first iteration of The Willing took place in Boston when I had my solo show at Prey Shadows Gallery, and I activated the installation there. And then I, unbeknownst to my family, because I flew them in from DC to Boston, my 11-year-old niece performed with me, and we told 5 generations of activist women in my family and sang an Ethiopian lullaby to sort of show the passing on, the maternal passing on of maternal lineage and stories. And we all professed our visions of kind of where we are in the world now and where we want to be. And we brought in the audience as well. So there's always this sort of communal, but it's always uplifting. Like, I'm not interested. I'm talking about really heavy stuff. I'm not always naming the exact struggle, but we all know these struggles existed and impacted these particular bodies. And then I am bringing in joy. And I think that's something that I love to do, is not to dwell on the negative, but to think
Right.
through the positive. And that's what I want people to walk away when they see my work. I want them to feel like it's possible because somebody did that for me. And so I do that for the next person.
That's fantastic. Let's advance to the next image. I think we're coming to the end of the slideshow. So is this your family?
No, maybe an adopted family, but not my family. This is the descendants of 3 civil rights male, black male luminaries, abolition and civil rights. Frederick Douglass's descendants are on the left. Dick Gregory and I'm sorry. So Frederick Douglass's descendants are Melania and Shira Douglass, Dick Gregory's daughter Ayanna Gregory, and James Baldwin's sister, Miss Paula Whaley. And this is the first project I did for By Way of Revolution. I did this. We filmed in 2018, and I edited and released it in 2019. It was a day-long gathering of 4 female descendants of heavily documented male activists, and they told the stories of the matriarchs in their family, which are often overlooked. The women, including the wives, and how they contributed to the civil rights movement and to abolition, and the mothers. And then they all told their visions of where they see we are in this current day. And honestly, all I did was gather and hit record. These women were fabulous. And I still love hearing, they all gave a song, they all gave testimony, they gave poetry. I was just blown away with the talent in the room. And so, that's what I love, is seeing us come together and to shine and to share. And that is medicine. That is survival. That is how our ancestors survived over time. That's what my mother gave me, what my grandmothers gave me. And so doing this for art, it's like, yeah, it's what I want to do. So yeah, it was a beautiful gathering. They gathered in Miss Paula Whaley's home in Baltimore, and then one of the oldest slave ports in the country, in Fells Point in Baltimore, Maryland, and they did a little performance there. So yeah.
That's really really interesting and so layered too. And I often think about that. I often think about the family members of all of these people who are written into history, and how they sort of get written in a way where they seem to have just fallen from the sky, as opposed to having come from a family like we all do, right? So it's quite interesting. I don't think I've actually seen James Baldwin's sister before.
She's an
That's
amazing
quite
sculptor.
interesting.
All those sculptures in the background is her work. So she's a living sculptor.
Fantastic. So the questions that have come in, and we can end the slideshow, and I'll try to get to. I have a couple more of my own questions, but these have come in. With your collage work, is it the process or the final product that's more important to you?
Process.
Yeah.
I don't think I would do it
Pretty.
if it was just a product. Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think it would
Yeah.
hold me. Yeah.
I get it. Yeah. And then the other question that came in is, when you get artist block, what do you do to get past that? This is, of course, assuming you get artist block.
I feel so fortunate that I don't get artist block. My problem is I have too many ideas. So what I do with that problem is I write them down because I can't do it all. And then somehow I try to do it all, but I usually can't. But I have a writing practice that is almost like it's almost like a journaling, or like a spiritual deepening, like kind of like a, maybe it's therapy, I don't know. It's just a way for me to get through my thoughts, because I tend to have a lot. If I were to have a writer's block, I would do the same thing. I'm sorry, an artist block, I would do the same thing. If the canvas was intimidating, like for my students it might be, I would find another way to get at the content. So a lot of times with my students, we do things like we go on walks together. We'll go on like really long walks all around campus or off campus, or in nature, and we'll just like observe, and then I'll instruct them. I'll give them homework that they have to do that every day, and then they have to journal after and see what comes up. So basically getting at the content from different angles. Maybe it's working out, maybe it's cooking a meal, maybe it's enjoying a meal, maybe it's spending time with friends and family. There's gonna be information all around us. It's about tapping
Right.
in. And usually I feel like a block is when we overthink it, and we think that's not important. Like that intuition,
Right.
that
Right.
inkling is not important. It's all important, but we just have to give ourselves permission to go there.
Thank you. Third question that's come in. The person says, I read your article about expressing Black womanhood within your work. What advice can you give to a young Black woman artist navigating their womanhood through art?
Hmm. I think kind of what I just said again, but I'll specify it for a woman, or somebody who identifies as a Black woman. That's such a identity is so personal. It's something people can label on you, but it's an exploration and a journey to understand it for yourself, and to understand its limitations and its constructs, and also ways in which it serves us. And so there's culture there, there's specificity of your culture. I feel fully grounded in the fact that I am an American woman, I am a Black woman, I'm also an Ethiopian woman, and it took a while to understand where that intersects and what parts of each culture I would like to draw from. But maybe there's specificity in your like specific Black womanhood. Are you from South Carolina or Georgia? Are you from Haiti? And maybe there's even like a story your grandmother would share, or maybe it's your grandfather, or maybe it's somebody outside of you, like a text that calls you. Like, are you reading like Saidiya Hartman? Like, who's inspiring you? Because somebody else is telling a story, and it's also informing and inspiring your own ancestral memory and your own story. So I would say listen and read and think about what's around you, and like whether it's other Black women or people of other ethnicities or gender identities, and then also listen and go deeper into your own. Yeah.
So we're coming down to the final 5 minutes, and you might notice that my screen has gotten darker because I'm using a combination of natural and artificial light. So the sun is sending me a signal like you're getting to the top of the hour here. Tell us, what are you working on now that you're excited about? Like, what's coming up?
Well, what I'm really excited about, to be quite honest, is taking a little break. I had like a 2 year sprint. Like, I mean, I was always making, then the pandemic hit, and then I was making about art and activism prior to the pandemic. And then all of a sudden people were like, oh yeah, art and activism. And then start getting a lot of calls. But
Right.
I'm like, I realized I was a sprint. This is a marathon. And what was so great about showing the Sharjah Biennial was, I mean, I was in the company of people who've been doing this like generations above me, like Isaac Julian and Carrie Mae Weems and Nari Ward, like these amazing artists who I realized they've had longer careers than I have because I'm also younger than them, and it is a long game. And so I am trying to kind of rejuvenate now this summer. That being said, I still have a bunch of group shows. So it's like my slowing down is somebody else's like speeding up. So it's like, I'm still
Right. It's
busy.
all right.
I probably have like 7 group shows. No, maybe more, 8 for the rest of the year. But I, it's less work than like a biennial or a solo show. So this is my slowing down. And some of those
I
shows, I'll just name them, is the Frist Art Museum has a really great show that I've been preparing for with the Tennessee Triennial. I've been working with Nashville women from Fisk University, and making a series of work digging into the National Public Library archives and the Fisk University Library archives. And the show will be on 53 Black collages, and it will tour to MFA Houston and the Phillips collection. That's coming up in the fall. The Walters Museum is also doing an Ethiopian contemporary art show, which will have a book just like the Frist Museum, and will travel to 3 sites. And LACMA has a group show coming up in November, and it's a photo-based show. And so those are some of the things you can find my work in.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And maybe you need that break, that like refresh. It's interesting what you say about it being a marathon. I had a meeting today with, with an artist that I think everyone would agree is one of the most like significant artists of our time, who's really successful and has made it. And so much of our conversation was about like you get to that point and you realize you still have all of this time ahead of you, and now you like what like now you have to keep going, right? It is a long it is a long, this person probably has another, who knows, 40 years of making art. It's another lifetime. So pacing oneself is important. But I think with the kind of work that you do, um, it's always needed. It's so urgent. It's so important. It's so important. And you also, you're making work that will resonate into the future, but you're also opening people's eyes up to forgotten aspects of the past. So it's this dual thing that, well, I hate to tell you, Helena, your work will never be done. You will always you will always have ideas and things to pull from, because there's so much yet to be discovered and yet to be uncovered. And I'm just happy that you're doing this work, and I'm really happy that you shared some time with us today to talk about who you are and what you're doing. I learned a lot. I've been following your work, for the past several years, half of which has been online through a screen. So here it is, another screen. We got to make sure that we get together in person one of these days, sometime soon. Yeah, and I'll give you a moment. If there any final thought you have before we conclude today's conversation, I'd love to hear it.
This was a really great questions from the audience and from you, Dexter. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for the venue for also inviting me to do this conversation. I guess I'll leave on the note, because I heard questions about people who are aspiring artists or interested in doing
Right.
this work, and there's always going to be some fear in making, doing something unconventional like being an artist. But tap into that, because on the other side of fear is this amazing liberation, like this beautiful opening for you. So if you are kind of like feeling stuck or afraid or following a creative path, like I'm like, lean into the thing that scares you. Even if you're already on the creative path, don't do the thing that feels safe. Because I was doing the thing that felt safe for a long time, and I was painting, it was felt safe to me, and not that painting is bad, but or worse or better than. But as soon as I opened up my practice and just went into the thing that scares me, which was being in front of a live audience and performing or whatever, everything just started to flow. So that's my last bit of advice.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Helina. So we're moving to our final words now. Well, everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you to the Harvey B. Gantt Center for hosting today's open air conversation. The Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt Center to expand its reach and further develop programs like Open Air. To learn more about the ways you can support the Gantt Center, please visit their website at ganttcenter.org/donate. Also, be sure to click the subscribe button below the screen to be updated on all future virtual programs. As always, we thank you all for joining us for Open Air. Be sure to follow the Gantt Center on social media to get announcements about upcoming programming. And join us on May 9th for our next Open Air Artist Talk with artist David Schroeb. Have a great evening, everyone.